Servus and hello, Matthias Eichler here, and this is Singletrack. One more episode for you before the holidays, and this one's super special. I'm bringing you a conversation with Kuwanna Dyer-Pietras, East Coast runner, Tailwind athlete, and just a couple weeks ago picked by Hoka to race Western States in 2024. Amazing! I chat with Kuwanna about the infamous gnarly trails of the East Coast, coming back after a DNF to chase your dreams and finding rejuvenation on the trail amidst the busyness of family life. Kuwanna and I met first as Tailwind ambassadors, and when I heard that Hoka had called and invited her to Western States as one of their sponsored slots, I had to chat with her and get all the details. But before we dive into the conversation, I wanted to give a huge shout out to all the racers that came out last weekend to our Saturnalia. We had incredible weather, record turnout, and course records broken for the men's, the women's, and for the first time, the non-binary races. Shout out to Keith Laverty, Team Run coach, for taking the victory in the men's race, Lindsay Fisher in the women's, and my kid, Reben Eichler, for the first non-binary racer at one of our Rock Candy running events. I'm proud of this little early holiday event we've created here, and we couldn't do it without the amazing support by our sponsors. Heritage Bank, Tailwind Nutrition, Kevin Hayward State Farm, Club Oli Road Running, REI Olympia, Nathan Sports, which provided awesome giveaways to all our finishers at this year's Saturnalia. If you're curious about rock candy races and can't wait to run the next one, Little Backyard Adventure is coming up in March. To our 6-hour race, we've added a 12-hour event. Come on out to LBA Park and challenge your endurance on a twisted 4-mile loop through these amazing city woods. Info you can find at rockcandyrunning.com. Early bird sign up for LBA ends New Year's Eve. All right, that's it. Let's hear from Kuwanna. Kuwanna, you're on Singletrack. We're just diving right in. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Where are you based out of right now?
I'm in a town called Vestal, which is, I'm looking out the window, is in New York, so an hour south of Syracuse.
Okay. So
most people know where that is.
Yeah, I think we can pinpoint that. I love talking to folks, trail runners who are running trails on the East Coast, because I know so very little about it. And I always joke about the West Coast bias, and even though I didn't even grow up on the West Coast, I feel it. In some respects, it feels like trail running is only a West Coast thing and the visuals are West Coast. So I always make a big point of like explain and share the kind of environment when you go out running on trails. What do you see? How is it different? What do your trails look like?
Well, the trails on the East Coast have a reputation for being pretty gnarly and technical, which is why I'm glad I got my start out here, because now I feel like, distances aside, I feel like course-wise, there's quite a few other things that I could do without trouble. I mean, we'll exclude the big mountain races, but just because of the challenge here. But we're talking every other step is roots, rocks. Mm-hmm. You know, you might have down trees, and depending on where you go, and a lot of steep hills, right? Again, I'm not in a mountainous area, but I'm either going up or I'm going down. And so every ultra I've done, even some of the really tough East Coast races I've trained in this general area and in Ithaca, it's all out here. Mm-hmm. So, but yeah, so quick description, lots of roots and lots of rocks. There's no smooth, it's no smooth running.
I ask everyone from the East Coast that, do you have any idea why the trails are different? Is it land management? Is it geology in terms of like the kind of trees and the way the roots grow? Like how do those trails end up being different?
Probably a combination of those things. I mean, if I just put my semi-retired geologist hat back on
for
a second, just thinking through the rocks, right? So there's a mix of bedrock around here, but also glacial till, and just depending on where you are exactly and where the ice sheet went to, 12,000 years ago. But I mean, maybe the trees too, right? The roots that come up, not under the ground, and maybe also because of the terrain, right? So it's hard for these roots to stay underground if you've got a lot of erosion on a surface and you're constantly washing the dirt away. So
Yeah.
just guess.
No, absolutely. I'm fascinated by this because in some respects it's something we don't think about, but it so very much shapes our trails and our experiences that we then have on these trails, right? I mean,
Mhm.
I come from Europe. For me, sort of my dream experiences are always high alpine, not necessarily immediately, Colorado. The air doesn't have to be thin, but
Right.
the idea of being above tree line, that's sort of
Mhm.
what I grew up with wanting out of my sort of experiences, if you will, right? Vacation experiences and stuff. And so now living on the West Coast and at sea level, I have to find joy, if you will, right? Being constantly in tree cover because there are trees everywhere and it's beautiful. It's different, right? But it's sort of like every time there is sort of a little clearing, a little opening, I'm like, that's why I run.
Exactly. So I do remember one of your Facebook posts some months ago where I think you did end up above tree line. And it was like a big celebration.
I know. It's always a big thing. We joke when we run in like forest managed land, and when then they come in and cut down a whole section of the forest. And in some respects, it's always sad, but over here, trees grow fast. It's a renewable resource. It's
Mhm.
also part of farming, if you will. It works, right?
Mhm.
But we always call it man-made alpine. It's like there's this one time when you actually get to see something.
Exactly.
So, East Coast, what got you into running? I read a little snippet that you're like you're running away from your daughters. No, no, no. You use it as a balance to deal with your teenage daughters. What motivates you to go and find trails?
Well, I started running in high school. And so
Okay.
for me, running, I was varsity cross country. It should have been 3 years, but it was only two because the one year I decided to not run and focus on my grades. Turns out my grades were not so good that year. So that's when I learned that running does create balance.
Okay, there
Um,
we go.
so just kind of stuck with shorter distances through my 20s, my 30s, so 5 and 10Ks. And then over the years got increasingly interested in the marathon. Um, so now we're looking back to about 2013, training for the first marathon. I fall, end up breaking the knuckle, my ring finger. I'm in a cast, so no marathon. Shelved that for a while. And some years later, it was kind of gnawing away at me.
Hmm.
So I still remember in 2017, I signed up for a half marathon and then at the last minute said, you know what, I'm not going to tell anybody. I'm not going to make a big deal out of it because the last time I got hurt, all I did was text my husband at the start line. I switched to the full. So if you don't see me after a couple of hours, you know why. So he
Nice.
didn't worry. But that basically planted the seed. And so from there, you know, because I was concerned about not getting in, I had signed up for another one. So 2 weeks later, I ran marathon number 2. And then I thought, okay, what else can I do? Um, First, I broke a hip, but once I came back from that, the fire was still, yeah, that's again, we can get in that if you want. But the seed had been planted. And so I had decided in 2020, I would run my first ultra marathon. And then the pandemic hit, and I said, you know what, I'm going to run it anyway. So then came the self supported run. And so, yeah, I did a year or two of self-supported ultra marathons, and a mix of road and trail. I have my start on the roads, and racing on roads. So for me, especially in the middle of winter, that's still a place to go back to, or if I need to add mileage, mix up the elevation so I get the right amount of gain. But the trails are a bit of a sanctuary. You can have so much going on, and the second you set foot in the woods, your mind goes quiet,
Hmm.
and it's just hard to explain. So I think just that regardless of how wrong things are at the moment, they're instantly right when you walk into the woods. And then when you come out, I feel like anything that I had been trying to solve and work through, I have the answers.
Hmm.
So then you go back and you deal with it. So,
It is true in our sort of like manufactured and controlled and busy and professional lives, right? Sort of going out on trail, actually hitting dirt and experiencing something um, so natural, right? I call it micro adventures, but it gives us sort of a different perspective of what life is all about. And in some
It's
respects,
so simple.
obviously, it is so simple, right? And it's a huge luxury that we can choose this because in some respects, we as a species are probably are ever increasingly trying to sort of create a more comfortable life, right? And so
Hmm.
to be able to be in a place where you can go out and experience this is a huge luxury, and at the same time we discover something, as you're saying, everything feels right at that moment, right? I mean,
Hmm.
it's beautiful. Has your perspective now as you're racing changed that you are running trails coming from the cross country world? I often hear folks being very focused on pace and time and competition, and that's sort of the motivating piece of why you train, right? But now that you're running trails, has things changed?
Well, I think except for the front runners, once you start running, especially steep trails, all that has to change because hey, what was a good pace, on the roads isn't necessarily going to be your good pace on the trail. But yeah, the perspective has changed. I mean, you want to continue to improve, but what does improvement look like? For me, it's not necessarily faster, other than just you don't ever want to be against the cutoff, right? So I've always been a mid-pack runner, mid-pack, slightly to the front, depending on what I'm running or where, but mostly mid-pack. And as long as I'm in there and I'm running well, I'm kind of out there for the experience, right? You see the trees, the birds are singing, the squirrel is getting a nut, you're rolling on the nuts because they're all over the ground, all of it, right? And so, but then, yeah, like obviously you want to do the best that you can. For me, like getting better, I guess more than faster translates into distance or terrain,
Mhm.
right? How tough of a race can I run? How far can I run? We're going to learn that next year.
We are going to learn this next year, and we're sort of leading up to this question. You got into Western States, coming
I
from the
did.
east, coming from the East Coast, huge jump, first 100 miler. I
It'll be the
mean,
first.
not many people make it their first 100 miler, which also leads to you got to explain how you got in there. This is amazing. Congratulations to begin with.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I was hopeful, as many people are, and I had a handful of friends who were also hopeful, and I know everybody was, paying attention to the lottery that day. I had it on the streaming on the living room TV, because I just, the computer is too small. I just had to see it, right?
Gotta see it big.
Exactly. But so that week, so it was interesting. Real quick, I DNF'd my race for that. I wanted to have the lottery ticket. I DNF'd last year and came back and finished it this year. And I said, okay, for the first time in my life, I have a ticket. The chances of one ticket are slim. But I
To
last year,
say the least.
right, that's an understatement.
Very
but
much.
but I had that opportunity to hope because last year it was over for me in August.
Yeah.
And I said, after one day of, poo-poo, I maybe I'm not cut out for this. The next day I said, no, screw it, I'm coming back. And so this year I had that period where I could hope, right? And so for me, that was already part of winning.
Mhm.
It's like
Mhm.
I can be hopeful between now and December because I have a shot at this, even if it's like, tiny like percent.
Yeah.
So my mind is focused on the lottery on that Saturday. Well, earlier that week, I get an email from Hoka. And I seriously think it's not legit at first. I'm like,
Yeah.
no. And I'm like, this person's asking me for my personal information.
It's like,
Apparently I won this nomination, got this, might be nominated or whatever.
yeah.
And he's like, oh, maybe you should look into it. Well, I did, and it was all legit. So I accepted. I said, yes, if I'd be willing to accept the nomination. And then next thing you know, I'm being told I've been awarded one of the sponsored slots that Hoka offers. And I just, yes, there are a range of emotions that week. There was laughter, there were tears, there was, because I mean, I was like most people going to be in this for the long run. Every year I'll keep doing this because that's the dream, right?
Mhm.
And so to have it come up in such a way. Like I like to say I'm grateful, but I feel like that's not enough. Like that word doesn't hold enough to embody like what, you know what I mean? Like the amount of gratitude
Hmm.
that I feel for the opportunity. So, the question was, well, would you be willing to commit this, to, 100% to doing this race? And I'm like, yeah, of course this will be, I mean, it was going
Yeah.
to be my priority regardless, but
Hmm.
that's easy. If you're sending me, of course.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, this is amazing, and I have got like millions of questions. Let's start at the DNF, the prior year. Why did you DNF? What happened?
I timed out. But it was so emotional for me. Everyone DNFs at some point, and it's an emotional experience. I wrote an article about it, but basically to unpack, but also share lessons. But really, what it boiled down to were there's many DNFs. There's a series of things that went wrong. And once I outlined those, everything from I can't have gluten, and based on how I was feeling then and the days that followed, I had gluten in me. So I'm like, that explains why I just couldn't run.
Mhm.
I overdosed on watermelon. Watermelon is very watery. And when you're hot and you're thirsty, don't have 3 slices or 3 wedges, because then, so I walked too much because I had a cramp. I slowed. I took a wrong turn.
Mhm.
I didn't make it.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and it's hard. I mean, it's bad enough if your body can't do it. But I was feeling better. I was ready to run. And they're like, nope, we can't let you continue. And I'm like, oh,
Oh, that's
oh, so
hard.
yeah, it was so surreal because you're standing there and they're taking down the aid station and everything. And you're like, but,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
I'm ready to run.
yeah.
So
I feel you. I've been a place. What race was that?
Twisted Branch.
Okay.
It's a 100K in between Naples and Hammondsport, New York.
Mhm, mhm. I do. I mean, I'm somebody who gets timed out all the time, and it is a really, really tough place to be in, right? On one side, you do understand the race organization, safety out on
Mhm.
the trails. You can't have volunteers out there for forever, right?
Right.
There's a limit to how long this can go. And so I understand that. But on the other side, it is such a devastating place to be in when you're like, you could totally finish this and you're not allowed to, right? That's sort of one of the worst feelings, right?
The helplessness.
Yeah, a little bit, right? And there was so much leading up to it. So you ran this race specifically with the hope to get yourself a ticket into the lottery. So you ran it again the next year and got in.
Yeah, and also the challenge because over the last, I mean, I started the ultras during the pandemic, but after that, it was very much like, what are the toughest races on the East Coast that are close to me, and
Hmm.
how many of those can I run? So Twisted Branch fit the bill in 2 ways. It was a qualifier, but it was also a really challenging race,
Hmm.
and so it's another way to get myself trained up and just to be stronger because I just really admired all of these coast runners who run all this stuff and make it look easy, right?
Yeah.
So I came back this year. Um, I did pretty well most of the year. I worked through some Achilles issues, switched shoes for the summer, strained a calf in July, let that recover, maintained the running, switched back to shoes. My husband got COVID 2 weeks before Twisted Branch. Yeah. So I came back and made it back to the start line.
Yeah.
And I
Okay.
was like, but after some of racing, right? I was excited to be there and I had fought to be there. I mean, trying to like quarantine a house, stay healthy, do all the, run a solo household and train.
Hmm.
Those were my biggest mileage weeks. But I'm like, my heel is, or sorry, too many injuries. My calf is in good shape. It's holding up. I'm getting my runs done. The kids aren't starving. Things are, so I can do this. So I showed up, and even though, I didn't have a whole lot left in the tank mentally because of that, but also just a summer of racing constantly. I just wanted to do all of them. It was a bit much in the end, but I finished. I crossed the finish line. And at around, I think it was mile 50, I ran into two women, a runner and her pacer. We had been leapfrogging, and I finally said, "Can I just tag along?" Casey and
Hmm.
Stacy. And I'm like, I love it. And they were the best. So I made two new friends, and we all finished together.
Hmm.
And yeah, that was the beginning of everything, really.
Yeah, fantastic. It's great to hear that. We often listen to stories of people who achieve something big, and they often talk about how all the stars sort of align, right? And you were able to achieve something without the stars aligning, right? I mean, with everything sort of being in your way and stacked against you, and yet you still were able to not just do something, but also come back from that feeling that last year you DNF'd at the same race, right? I mean, that sort of hovers over you as you're going into this. And at every checkpoint, I need to be faster here. I need to be better here, right? And
I came through that aid station 2 hours sooner,
nice, amazing.
right?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's amazing. And it's also great to hear that you found for the last few miles some folks that you were able to tag along with, because I've been in these long races towards the tail end, and sometimes it's really tough. Sometimes there's no one there for hours, seemingly, right? Or if you see someone, they're already in such a bad space that you like, I don't know if I want to run with you.
I know, because I mean, you're trying to hang on to your own headspace or what's left to it. And do you have enough in you to lift them? Sometimes I think we're all running not on empty, but close to it. So it's like, yeah, I hear you.
It
Kind of.
becomes a little bit of sort of you feel like the distraction can be so helpful, but if you don't have anything in you, then it becomes a little bit of fight for your own self, right? And you then also don't want to drag the other person down. So sometimes you're like, I'm just gonna leave you either ahead or behind, and I'll mumble and argue with myself.
That's right.
All right, so you've made this amazing. You got your ticket, and then Hoka calls. How did Hoka find out about you?
So, from my understanding, the way it works is that, and I think different organizations that they work with or sponsor events for, people in charge of those are able to put forth someone that they want to nominate who's has to, and the rule is that they have to actually qualify first, right? Can't be
Hmm.
just anyone.
Yeah.
So from the qualifying list of entrants, put forth a name like someone they know or they've worked with that they would like to nominate. And so I wasn't sure if I was gonna. I don't know if it's a big deal. I'm not necessarily going to announce the person, but I was nominated because I don't know if they want to be anonymous. But I was nominated by someone that I've worked with, organization, and then Hoka had however many slots. I don't know exactly how many slots, if it
Yeah.
changes per year, but I know ultimately there were three of us who were nominated and accepted. And so, yeah, I'm
Fantastic.
still,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
still pinching myself, but they're all very nice. I've talked to them now a few times, and
Yeah.
messages and stuff, and they're all great, seem to be great people. So
Yeah.
I'm excited.
It's amazing. Especially in a race like Western States, it's so hard to get into that there are these ways, and we often hear of alternate ways, but then it's often the elites sort of being able to take
Right.
advantage of it, right? And you are
I
an
think
elite in your own way, but you are not a professional runner.
no, no, and I think a lot of it too. The idea is behind this is that over the years we've been trying to increase the diversity in the sport.
Mhm.
And so, for me, like, so, and that's, if you look at who Hoka has sponsored, last year, I don't know all of the runners. This year, I only more familiar with this year. But the idea is that, like, because if, this is a way to increase diversity in the sport, we were all in the lottery, right? We
Mhm.
all qualified. But if our names didn't happen to get drawn this year, because that's how lotteries work, then if, as a, running just organization, all the groups involved are trying to increase diversity, then I guess this is a missed opportunity, right? As opposed to if you like in Hoka's case, they have these, sponsorships where it's like, okay, if we, believe that this person will help increase the diversity of the sport by showing up to the start line, right?
Yeah.
Then we can offer these. But that's kind of, it works for me because that's how I've preferred to do this. Like I realized years ago, I don't have a big, even my previous account, I had a few more followers. My Instagram is a bit smaller now because I quit and started over. But for me, like, because I never had the ginormous platform, like I don't have the voice that a lot of other, athletes do on social media. I said, you know what, I'm just going to start showing up to stuff. So, and I started in my area because, with kids, I try not to travel too far. Western States is going to be a family vacation. My daughter's already planned it out, but typically I've just kind of kept the radius small, but I'm like, what are the toughest races around here? And I just start showing up. Now, the way it's worked for me is I've made so many friends in the process because the trail community is great and for me has been very welcoming from the beginning. But then the way I'm going to show up to Western States is great because, but that's just it. I'm going to show up,
Yeah.
And I guess I wanted to share this story real quick, if you don't mind.
No, of course.
Along those lines, which really kind of like lit that fire even more, is when I was running Tioga Trails this year. So that's a race in Ithaca, goes through Buttermilk Falls and Tremont Park. Beautiful run. It's probably my favorite. Ian Golden is the race director.
Shout out to Ian Golden. He's a host of the trail running film festivals. I know him that way.
That's awesome. That's good. Yeah. I'm glad I've come to know him too. I'm running this race in June, this past June, and I'm running once this is later on. So I'm almost finished, last handful of miles. And I pass a couple of families, and I'll say Hispanic. I don't know exactly which country they were from, but Spanish speaking. I am not, but I look similar enough to the women. I didn't think much of it until I see them along the side of the trail, because the dads were hanging out with the children, clapping their hands, saying to me, "Si tu puedes." And I get goosebumps now. And I realized, I said, oh my gosh, they've seen all kinds of runners come through here. And now they have someone that looks similar to them with a, hydration pack and a bib. And I thought, so I laughed. I said, well, I understand that. And they laughed too. And I thank them. I mean, I know a tiny bit of Spanish, but it was amazing. I get goosebumps every time I think about it. Because, there's people that inspire me that I look up to. So to think that I, in that moment, inspired these women who were hiking, around the falls and stuff is amazing, because I don't see myself that way. But if it happens, then great.
Yeah. That's an amazing story. I mean, it just highlights and speaks to how much representation matters, right? How much it matters that we find ways of lifting people up in the sport and telling stories of people that don't just fit the typical mold of professional sponsored athlete the way it just has always been in the past, right? We have to ask ourselves these questions. How can we bring more diversity and representation into the sport, and at the same time also acknowledge that our sport is really welcoming, right? I mean, sometimes it's really just a math equation of history and tradition and lottery challenges and stuff, right? It's not, somebody isn't actively trying to gatekeep this, but sometimes it's just systemically, we just haven't really figured out a way of opening this up, and representation is exactly that, right?
Right. And I found my community once I started trail running. So, and I want, more people, of color and not, to know women, like anyone who's curious, to be able to find that same community too. It's great. I love it.
Oh, fantastic. Well, super. So Now you've got Western States ahead of you.
Hmm.
What I wanted to ask prior to your qualifying race, did you adjust your training? Did you focus differently getting into this?
You mean coming back to do Twisted Branch?
Hmm.
No, because I knew. So when I figured out what had happened in the previous race, right? But I knew that I had the legs under me because was it 3 weeks later I ran 50 miles at Virgil Crest, which is like even more difficult, and second place.
Hmm.
So
Fantastic. Yeah.
when I podium, it's an accident, by the way,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
once in a while it
Nice.
happens.
Nice.
But I knew I knew what I had done was working. So winter is always the easy miles. If it's super cold or snowy, I sleep an extra day. It's a way to recover.
Yeah.
Just nothing too extreme. Try to hold back until February, and then we ramp it up again. But I basically did maybe change things slightly. Instead of multiple days in a row of running, I might go every other day. But mileages were roughly the same. Training, I mean, I just go and run all the hills I can, which isn't always the answer, but at least in the short term, I knew it was going to work. And yeah, I mean, when I showed up from the first few miles, I'm like, yeah, I have so much more run in me. And I knew I had some doubts. I had some dark moments. I think that's normal. But overall, I knew I could get to the finish line. I knew I was strong enough.
Yeah. Fantastic. So now getting into Western, first 100 miler, huge, daunting, different trails, different region. I mean, there's so much to prepare for. Are you freaking out? Are you meticulously planning? Are you throwing yourself into the hands of a coach to get you there? How do you approach this?
I've always been self-coached, and I always feel like I've run by intuition. And then years ago, I read an interview, Courtney DeWalter, who runs by intuition. I go, okay, good. Not everyone has a coach, and that's okay. There's people that benefit from coaches, but I like to just do it myself. But I mean, as for training, yeah, I always said it'd be good to have a 100 miler before I do Western States. So the irony is that this will be the first. But other than training for specific things, obviously you need the distance and some elevation, but the heat, right? So I'm more focused on what things are going to be different, because elevation gain at Virgil Crest is more than Western States. Twisted Branch is comparable. Niagara Trails is comparable. All I'm doing at this point is making the distance. So as far as like elevation gain and loss, I'm accustomed to that.
Mm-hmm.
Trails, I haven't seen the trails other than photos, but they look a little less technical, other than, again, we're dealing with mountains, but I'm not stepping over rocks and roots constantly. For me, the focus is going to be on the heat training and altitude. That's one thing I don't have here.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know the highest is at the beginning, which is great. Fresh. Just kind of get through that 9,000 feet or whatever, and then you start going down after that. But really, heat. I mean, I'm already thinking, am I going to be running in leggings and long sleeve shirts in the spring? Maybe, whatever it takes. I mean, I try to train for the heat anyway and go, I'll deliberately wait till noon if I can.
Mm-hmm.
The kids are in school, and then go then. So will that mean just adding more clothes on top of that? We'll find out. But that's kind of where I'm thinking so far, but not freaking out. For me, even the races I've done here, it's like I've learned that if you train, other than some jitters, if you do the homework, you don't have to freak out.
Mm-hmm.
You'll be ready. So just do the homework.
Yeah, fantastic. You're in a good headspace. Well, you're also a few months out still. Perhaps if I'll check in with you 3 weeks prior, you get jitters and we'll take over.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, it's kind of weird. I mean, you were talking about how gratitude doesn't really cover. For so many people, Western States is the ultimate dream race, and to get it so quickly, get in so quickly, yeah, it becomes total sudden, right? Was Western States always the big dream race? Was that something that you sort of settled in to say, okay, I'm going to be spending the next 8 years on trying to get in?
Yeah, I mean, the earliest days, I was happy just feeling out the distances. I did up to not quite 100K by myself at a park doing loops.
Hmm.
And so for me, it was like the early days were really just about experiencing that. What does it feel like once you get through that marathon wall, past the marathon mark, and then all of a sudden you have a second wind,
Hmm.
right? But yeah, I guess of the higher profile races that I started to learn about, just like everyone does, you know, you hear about Hard Rock and Leadville and Western States and UTMB. The other ones all look amazing, but for some reason, Western States kind of just caught my eye. And maybe I think because of the history behind it, which I'm rapidly trying to get myself caught up on, so I understand. And then just, yeah, how long it's been around.
Hmm.
So I think that's why I was leaning more toward that from the beginning.
Yeah.
The other concern is others like Hard Rock with that much altitude. Maybe
Yeah.
later.
Yeah, yeah. And it takes a special person to be able to absorb that, or somebody with a lot of time to acclimate properly, right? I
Right.
mean, I am awful in altitude. I mean, I just DNF'd Kodiak,
Mm,
blaming altitude for it, um, and so no, yeah, I think that's where Western States is a little bit more appealing. But it is also so fascinating that in this country that is so big and has such large history in trail running that we don't have more races that really live up to that hype and standard and sort of
hmm
prestige and stuff, right? I mean,
hmm
I'm listening to the trail media in its trying to come to terms with what UTMB is, sort of trying to wrestle into our down our throats if we love it or not, right? And I'm like, it is so fascinating that these couple races have generated. Right? You yourself mentioned essentially really only 3 races in the U.S. and Leadville has history, but is also kind of has lost a little bit of its shine and attention, right? And
hmm
we
hmm
don't really think of a lot of other events, and none of them on the East Coast, right? I mean, there is no real race on the East Coast that truly sort of is sort of the East Coast version of Western States, right?
Well, there's
And
Eastern states,
I mean,
but
there
it
it,
doesn't. But it doesn't have right as far as the notoriety and all
yeah,
the attention. Yeah.
yeah, it exists by name, right? But it's sort of, and I'm curious if it's for
It
me as
must be the
somebody.
mountains.
The mountains, do you think that the vistas, I mean, that's what UTMB is in many ways, right? I mean, the
Right.
imagery that we see from UTMB is so iconic that, I mean, who has ever stepped a foot on trails with a pair of running shoes wouldn't want to run in that kind of environment, right?
hmm
I mean,
Right.
I agree, but in a sense, the imagery is media, right? And so there
Mm,
is a way of controlling that, if
hmm
you will. And I'm saying that in a positive way, right? I mean, we
Right.
can tell different stories. We can tell stories of different environments and put trail runners into other places and make something iconic, right?
hmm Right.
So, that's fascinating. All right, so Western States it is. So inside baseball a little bit, do you have any expectations from Hoka in the way you need to sort of like, are you required to post regularly about this, or like are there any strings attached to it? How does this work? I'm curious. As much as you can tell. I don't know how if
Yeah.
you're under NDA or whatever.
Oh no, no, no. If there are strings, they haven't. Those have not been disclosed.
Okay.
I
It's a
I
little
don't.
late in the game now. You accept
Yeah,
it.
exactly. I think it's pretty open as to how you like. There's no, which I find refreshing because that was one concern. Like, I'm not an influencer.
Mm.
I want to share, but for me, it's always about the running. So it's like I just again not having the followers and not having the I don't even know what, but so there haven't been really any expectations. It really just has been very much about, we want to make sure you have the things you need to get to the finish line, which is great. And so I've gone ahead and posted a little bit, and again, waited to do the initial post because I knew I had friends that didn't get into the race. And so I didn't want to be like, woohoo, look at me. So being respectful of that, but then also being respectful of a company. My shoe company, by the way, the icing on the cake is I run in Hoka. So
I was going to ask if when they said we want to make sure you have everything, if that means that you have to now run in different shoes. I'm glad that you're already running in them.
Yeah, it really worked out because the speed goats are what I've run in all these races I've mentioned. So I really don't want to run in anything else for this one.
Yeah.
So there's been no expectations, but I have gone a bit and shared a little bit because they are doing really great things for us, even in the short term so far, a few weeks span. And so I've put a little bit up, but I always want to make sure it's authentic. So I just find that balance between posting to the point where people stop paying attention because it's too much, but not posting enough and leaving Hoka hanging because, they're doing an amazing thing for us.
Yeah. Well, I think your teenage daughters are going to keep you in check, right? I mean, if they scroll down, or they're probably not even on Instagram, right?
They're not on. I know social media for these kids. I'm like, I'm a stickler for that.
Nice, good. Try to keep it as long as you can. At some point, the dam will break, and then it's over.
Yeah, I figure in the next couple of years. But.
Nice. Okay, that's good. Well, super. But that's good. So how's the response been with you sharing? I mean, you said you tried to be sort of respectful of the people who didn't get in. But of course, I mean, everybody is excited, right?
Yeah. And so I will say the initial post about me getting in, I had more likes on that post than any other post. So and that made me feel good because I know last year when I saw people get in, like I was excited. And anything, whether it's a different race, I know people have gotten into hard rock at the same time, or just doing well in a local race. Like I'm excited for them. Even when I DNF'd, I was like excited for my friends who finished, right? Because that's just how it is. So I was happy to see that reciprocated. But there were a few folks that I thought would be like who I have more of a rapport with that seemed a bit lukewarm. And I don't want to read into anything too much because it's social media. It's not a face-to-face conversation.
Yeah.
But again, it's me just stepping delicately, trying to just share. I mean, what is good news, right? Why wouldn't you want to share? Yeah. But share it in a respectful manner. But I mean, even my husband said, he's like, you need to stop worrying about it so much because, years ago, I applied for things and then didn't get them, different ambassadorships with shoe companies and didn't get it, watched other people get it, so he's like, you've been involved long enough, you've made contacts, you got a nomination, they picked you. He's like, so stop worrying about what other people think so much.
Yeah. It is an interesting sort of new world. Before social media, perhaps the expectation would have been that you, I don't know, would show up at a Hoka store or something like that, right? Where they would sort of trying to sort of, I'm not saying use you, but sort of build a relationship. Well, now they sort of leave that up to you, but it doesn't matter who it is. Our sport is small enough that there's no media training, right? There's no official guide on how to navigate this. I mean, I watched some of these like Netflix documentaries like Drive to Survive with Formula One, right? And when you see these top Formula One drivers on camera, there's always sort of a media guy in the shadow that directs what they say, how much they say, right? But our sport doesn't have that. You have to figure this out yourself, and you have to sort of live with the consequences. And it does make it for an interesting thing. And just as your husband said, I mean, in some respects, it is something that is real, and therefore you can obviously share and post about it, right? I think that's sort of where things fall apart in when I see stuff, when people try to make things up on social media that aren't actually real, right? I
Right.
mean,
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
Well, fantastic. So, okay, so now training. We talked about this a little bit. Heat training. My coach told me I should go in a sauna the few weeks before I ran canyons last year, which I felt like really helped me. That's always a good idea. And well, let's talk a little bit about your strategy because you say you have a gluten sensitivity. Let's talk a little bit about how you approach this in races. Do you bring a lot of your own stuff, or are you just eating watermelon?
The watermelon is great. No, so I'm also a Tailwind ambassador, and in these long races, in fact, that was the main reason I finally had to upgrade my hydration pack, is I carry sticks of Tailwind, and I carry all the sticks I need for a 50 mile or 100K. They're all in the bag.
That's heavy.
So yeah, so yeah, when you lift that after a while, and you're like, that's kind of much, but if you train enough, then that's not a big deal. You get used to it. So for me, really fueling, I've run, I mean, other than a bite of watermelon or banana, I've run these races exclusively on Tailwind.
Wow.
And so, right. So because I can't and won't risk,
Mhm.
other than the fresh fruit, which I can see what it is,
Mhm.
I won't risk the contamination or eating something that doesn't work. I mean, again, there's food everywhere. They could potentially have a breadcrumb on the watermelon. You have to decide how much risk you want to take. But for me, that has worked so far. Um, but yeah, so mostly it's just liquid nutrition.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I've started practicing here already. So, like the other day before my run, I ate a whole banana. And rather than wait a while, I put my shoes on and went. And it was fine. But I
Mhm.
thought, well, let me start doing more of that to try and train myself to eat, I guess, more bananas. For
Yeah.
me to get between the 100K mark and the 100-mile mark, what is that going to look like? Am I going to need something different? Especially in those times when I just don't want the electrolytes, I just want water. Well, then I might need to eat something more. So there's going to be some experimenting, but I don't heavily rely on aid stations because I just don't know, and I don't want it to derail the race.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, with super long races, you can work with drop bags, so you don't have to carry all of it. That makes it a little easier. But being so completely self-reliant on one side is super impressive, because for me, there are two pieces. One is I always feel like halfway through my race, the stuff that I prepare for falls apart. It doesn't work anymore.
Mhm.
Um, and then the other thing is just that I feel like I can't carry enough. I probably need to train this more. You're like a really good Tailwind ambassador. I'm not that good. I love Tailwind, but it doesn't work for me 100%. For you, it works so well. You're really the perfect example of what Tailwind wants to promote, which is that's the only thing you need.
Really?
Really? Oh man, we've got the marketing slogan, and I'm gonna write
That's
Tailwind
funny.
an invoice for that episode.
That's right.
um, so will you have a crew? Will your daughters crew you at Western? I mean, is it something you think about, pacer crewing, or are you gonna be like tunnel vision?
Yeah, a lot of tunnel vision. The whole self-reliant bit. So yeah, I prefer not to do drop bags because I'd rather just have it with me. And
Wow.
that's for better for worse, right? Because 100-miler will mean even more sticks of Tailwind. So we'll have to see what happens. Certainly by the time the sun is going down, I think, change of clothes, because I usually don't change clothes a race. I don't change shoes or socks, muddy or not, I just go. Um, that might be the opportunity because the sun will be down and it will be down for a while. This is not 19 hours like Twisted Branch. This will be, 10 more on top of that.
Yeah.
So maybe less, fingers crossed. But anyway, So I'll have to figure that bit out. As far as crewing and pacing, I've never had a crew. So I think I'm more leaning toward pacers right now. Like I would like running buddies at night during cougar country, in cougar country, because that's one thing we don't have here either is cougars.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I mean, there's other stuff, and not everyone sees one. It's not like I'm making it bigger than it is. But just having had the company after the sun went down this last time was nice. But as far as a crew, like we'll see how many people I line up who might want to come out. But I'm laughing at myself because I'm like, I'm not sure what I would want them to do. Like, oh, I told my husband, I said, if I come in and they, because the idea is like, rather than have to wait and fill your flask with water and mix it in, someone hands you filled flasks and off you go, right? So that's kind of nifty.
Mm-hmm.
But I also don't stop at aid stations that I don't need anything from. So I shave off time that way. So then when I do need to fill, I have it. So I've started turning some ideas around in my head, but I have to decide exactly how I want to do this, depending on how many people I get, but mostly running buddies.
Mm-hmm. It is an interesting challenge because we see the videos of the elites running and they have such a dial pit stop crew and it feels so efficient and convenient that it feels like that's the differentiating factor. But you're speaking to a really good point, which is either you need to be extremely explicit, which means you have to have figured out what you actually want them to do, or you need to have people who are so intuitively dialed to what you need and what a racer in a situation like that needs, that you can respond to that in the moment, right? I once ran a race many years ago when my kids were really little and they saw me at an aid station and it was super cute and fun, but it was also not very helpful in the end, right? I hope they're not listening to this episode, right? I mean, they were little,
They were
right?
little,
Right?
yeah.
I mean, it felt a little bit more distracting than helpful, right? And it did make me think that I don't know if I really need it, but then every time I do feel like I need to get a rock out of my shoes or so, right? And you think of these videos where somebody is there to untie your shoe for you. You're like, oh, that would be kind of nice.
Did the little ones not want you to leave?
I don't know. I think it was sort of this, it's this headspace thing, right?
Because sometimes they cry after you, don't go.
Yeah, I don't even think it was something that they did, right? It was more me responding as a parent,
right?
Especially as a young parent, where it almost feels like you feel guilty for doing something so selfish, being hours away from them, right? And then getting sort of pulled back into this family unit, right?
Yep.
You're sort of reminded that you should be with them, and so it's in a really kind of interesting sort of place to sort of be in, because it's good to do these things for us. It makes us stronger coming back into the family. But sometimes when that interplay happens right in between, right? I mean, often the runners they don't want their parents to crew them because they might ask them, oh, how are you doing? Or they respond to a slightly bloody knee, a little bit too empathetic, right? And you're like, no, I need you to smack me in the face, wake me up, and kick me back onto the trail. Don't be too nice to me, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, it works the other way too. Makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of in an interesting play. Well, you seem to be super dialed. That's super exciting for you. You've got several months to prepare, I hope, and we can check in with you for folks who want to kind of follow your journey. Share your social media with them. We'll link it in the show notes so people can see how you're preparing for Western and getting yourself to Auburn.
Yeah, it's at Dyer-Pietras, but I was wondering about spelling it, but if you're going to link it, then that'll cover it.
No, that's perfect. And Instagram is the best place for them, for folks.
Instagram is good.
Fantastic. Kuwanna, thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a great holiday. Any fun food traditions? Let's finish off with that. I'm from Germany. I always bring like huge German food into my family. What is Christmas Eve, Christmas Day? What are the crazy things you eat?
Well, I unfortunately have not been as good at bringing in my mother's dishes. Although maybe this year, my mother always had a ham on Christmas Day, and my husband decided this year he wanted a ham, so they're going to do that. But I've recently returned to being plant-based, so I'll be eating the sides. But things were pretty simple around here as far as the food. So a ham, mashed potatoes, perhaps sweet potatoes, carrot salad, but there's a lot of cookie baking that happens.
Okay.
And so, Toddles, which is an Italian Christmas cookie, that's his side of the family. Sugar cookies that they get to decorate. Grandma's coming, so she'll help. So, yeah,
Cool.
That's, I think, what we'll be doing this next week.
Nice. I like it. There are a couple good flourless German Christmas cookies that exist that I often make that work for people who can't have gluten. I don't know if it's just the flour sensitive to, but well, I guess they have eggs in. So I mean, if you're completely vegan, that wouldn't work either.
But I have all the substitutes, so I still bake cookies.
Nice.
Just without any of that, because you have to have cookies.
I mean, you absolutely do. You absolutely do. And for me, it needs to be special cookies. Like when somebody comes and just makes a peanut butter cookie for Christmas, that's not Christmas.
Well, but that's what I was going to make today. I feel called out. But that happens to be my favorite cookie. But I agree, at Christmas time, it's fun to do a sugar cookie with the icing that you decorate, or like you said, something a bit extra.
Yeah, no.
So I will agree.
They're fantastic. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. I very, very much appreciate you coming on Singletrack and sharing a little bit of your journey towards Western stage in 2024.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.